officially start first seminar of the spring quarter. So for students, I'm told you need to attend 7 out of the 8. We've got 8 seminars. So you know how that works. By now you know the rules about expectations, about being here and being engaged and no devices and staying through till the end. I would love to see more people fill in these seats up here. It's a little weird to talk to a room where everybody is in the back half of the room. Tara's very friendly. She's not going to bite you. Okay. In fact, if she calls on anybody, she'll call on people in the back. I'm sure. And then we have a couple of announcements. So if you can stick around this afternoon, there's another really great event happening just after this, the WTS gathering. Michelle, Carl, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so I'm secretary on the board of the WTS, which is Women in Transportation Seminar, and we're all about advancing women in transportation, and all genders. But we are having an event this afternoon with Griffith, who is our campus planner, is going to be here speaking, and so is Evan Schmidt. She is the senior director at Valley Vision, and they're going to be talking about a plan that they've put together for the future of transportation for the campus industry. So it should be super exciting, and this plan just recently got announced, and so welcome you all to come.
And then after that, you can go to the
Happy hour. We're starting ITS happy hours. We did our first one in a long time yesterday. A lot of people showed up. So if you didn't, you missed out on a great experience. We're going to do the next one Wednesday at City Hall. Probably. We're going to figure it out. We're going to send out another thing, so if you're not on the emailer, you can get on it. So thanks.
Yeah, so thanks to all you students who are helping to arrange for these extracurricular activities for everybody else. There are plenty of seats up here. Plenty of seats up here. Up here. All right, official start. Welcome to everybody here and everybody out there listening in to the first seminar of spring quarter. I'm delighted to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Tara Goddard, who is an assistant professor in the planning program at Texas A&M University in College Station. Tara's start in transportation was here at UC Davis. She's a graduate of the civil engineering program here. After she finished her master's degree, she went on to a couple of different professional jobs in transportation, including the bicycle and pedestrian coordinator for City of Davis for a few years. Decided then she needed to go on for a PhD, and I'm not sure I'm ever going to forgive her for this, but she went on to Portland State to do her PhD up there with a good friend of mine up there, rather than coming back here. That's okay, I understand. Anyway, she's doing really cool work around walking and bicycling and sort of safety issues, and I don't want to say too much about it. You're going to tell us about it, but kind of delving into some areas that, well, I think nobody else is really doing. I mean, you're really kind of innovating with the kinds of questions that you're asking. So with that, please join me in welcoming Tara and enjoy what she has to share with us. Thank
you. Okay, good? I'm not bumping it? All right, hi everybody. First, I just want to say in my defense, I went to Portland State instead of Davis for my PhD because Pat Mokhtarian told me I'd have a better shot of getting hired here someday if I went somewhere else first. That's how much I love it here. Okay, so this stuff Susan said about me, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but yeah, I did my master's in civil engineering here at ITS Davis. Also, ITS Davis Happy Hour was a huge part of being here and feeling supported as a student, so do that, be part of it. Then I went to the city of Sacramento as a transportation planner for 2 years, and then got the opportunity to be the bicycle and pedestrian coordinator for the city of Davis. And I found this picture, I was looking for old pictures. This is me as the Davis bike coordinator in Sanju, Korea, which is a sister city of Davis. It's the bike city of Korea. So we got to go, and I got to get an honorary citizenship. But it was really cool, and I encourage you to go and check out Sanju sometime. So this is me giving a talk at a bike shop / bar in Portland, Oregon, talking about my research. So that's what's going on there. So yeah, I went and did a PhD in urban studies looking at driver-bicyclist interactions at Portland State, and then I was lucky enough to get an assistant professor job at Texas A&M University in very sunny and hot College Station, Texas. So, well, let me back up for a sec. So Susan and Anne-Marie kind of gave me a lot of leeway in what I would talk about today. So rather than coming to you and just kind of reporting out or talking about some of the studies I have done, I'm going to be talking to you about kind of, I think, a very interesting area of research that I'm working on an NSF grant, and a few other people are talking about, and I really encourage you to be thinking about whether you're more on the engineering side. There's pieces of, kind of the autonomous world and automation and all that is just such a huge part of our industry right now, and definitely in the time I've been doing this, which is getting to be extensive, never have I seen things changing at such a rapid pace and so many different people involved, and people getting involved in transportation that weren't necessarily, and there's pros and cons of that, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. So I encourage you as I talk about kind of weaving together these different pieces about vulnerable road user safety and automation and autonomous stuff, think about how it applies to what you're doing or what you're interested in, or whether there is a role you might have in this research going forward. So just so we're all kind of on the same page as best you can in this rapidly changing world, these are some of the acronyms and a little bit of some of the terms I'm going to be using in this talk. So VRUs, vulnerable road users, that's everybody without the protective shell of a vehicle. So bicyclists, pedestrians, motorcyclists, as a transit user, when you're outside of the transit vehicle, you're a vulnerable road user. People with different abilities, different assistive devices, right? And then because I talk about this, anytime I can get on my soapbox, I will not be using the word accident. The British Medical Journal outlawed using it as far back as 2001 because traffic crashes are preventable, predictable. And so there's, using the word accident can sometimes obscure the fact that somewhere in the chain it could have been prevented. ADAS is Advanced Driver Assistance System, so I'll be talking more about that. When I say AV, I mean autonomous vehicles. And then we get into this tricky bit where a lot of different terms are being used. So some people say partially autonomous, some people say conditionally. That's a word I'm seeing more frequently right now. I think the SAE is using conditionally. Semi-autonomous, I've seen. All of those require involvement from a human driver. Mostly we think of those as a human driver in that vehicle, but not necessarily. So that's something that's happening, right? We have kind of like drone pilots, but for autonomous vehicles. Then you also see self-driving and driverless. And so the AAA did a survey, and they found, I have the note in my notes here, 40 different brand names just for automatic emergency braking, 20 different names for adaptive cruise control, 19 different terms for lane keeping assistance. And the point of that is just that it's a confusing, changing world, and there's a lot of misperception about what these things even do. And 40% of the people that they surveyed, when they saw like autonomous, like Tesla autopilot, they thought the car could drive itself, right? And that's not at all what's happening. So we have a real disconnect or misperception about what these technologies can really do. So just briefly again, so that we're all kind of on the same page, when you hear about the SAE, like level 2 or level 3 autonomous, this is what they're talking about. So it ranges from how much a human, so this is typically what we think of driving, right? Level 0, and then these technologies that assist what we're doing, like the lane departure warnings and corrective steering and braking. And then I like this one because this is an older way of phrasing it, but this feet off, hands off, eyes off, mind off, right? But a lot of times we're seeing this as a kind of, as if it's a pure linear scale, and it's really not. There's a lot of technologies that might push it somewhere towards level 2 and other aspects that make it more like level 1 that can really have a huge effect on safety. This is a more complicated diagram, and it's one that's I'm seeing a lot more, and I just put it up there so if you see it, this is what's going on. So they're trying to better characterize what are the levels, and then breaking it down by the steering and acceleration, the braking, who's supposed to be monitoring the environment, who's the fallback when automation fails, and then when the system is in control. And for the most part of this talk, I'm really interested in these two areas, right? And I'm going to explain why I'm interested in that more than full automation. This one is another one I found from MarketWatch research where if you look at this cracks me up, the way they're kind of envisioning our automation, and then also take a look at the built environment behind it that they're envisioning go along with these, as though this built environment is going to go away when we get these kind of cars. And as someone living in Texas, that's definitely not happening in the near term, in the 5 to 10 year time frame. So one of the things you may have heard that pops in everyone's mind when talking about autonomous vehicles is the trolley problem. And if you're not familiar with the trolley problem, it's actually really old. 1905 is when people think they can trace it back to. But the idea of the trolley problem is there's a trolley, it loses its brakes, it's out of control, and there's a person here who has the opportunity to throw the switch and change which direction it goes. If the trolley goes this way, these 5 people are killed. If it goes this way, this one person is killed. Well, first of all, that's it's kind of a horrifying thing to think about, but it's a philosophical argument. So if these are all strangers, then it tends to be easier for people to say, well, obviously you kill the 1 and not the 5. But then in the next step of this philosophical exercise is, well, what if this is his cousin or the godfather of his parents or something? Does that change the calculus about who we kill or don't kill? Here's the other version, which I hadn't seen before, maybe some of you have seen, of the person on the bridge in blue has the opportunity to push someone off, a large person, in fact, off the bridge to stop the train from killing these 5 people. So, again, what are these decisions we're making? But in here, it's inevitable that one person will die or not, and then this one, it's like, well, this person would have been fine if we left him on the bridge. This is the trolley problem making its way into pop culture. This is one of my favorite shows. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. But again, an example, so this character in the show is paralyzed with indecision. And so he's forced to go through the trolley problem over and over and over, sometimes knowing the people, sometimes it's himself he's running over, etc. So this trolley problem, my point about this is that it's really made its way into pop culture again. So looking at who's talking about autonomous research, I did just a very quick and dirty search of the Web of Science. And this is, I looked all through time, and as you can imagine, most of the work on autonomous vehicles is pretty new. But this is looking at it by the field, published papers, who's mostly been publishing on looking at autonomous vehicles. So you see, electrical and electronic engineering, computer science, robotics, control systems. Really not a lot, when you're talking about when I just searched for autonomous vehicles, not a lot of people stuff in here, right? Not a lot of behavioral social scientists in here. When I did a search for looking at autonomous vehicle and pedestrian, or autonomous vehicle and cyclist, first of all, it's a very small percentage of the studies, and you start to see it pick up, so it's improving, but it still makes up a small percentage of who is looking at these issues. And again, even though we are starting to look at people outside the autonomous vehicle, it's still largely dominated by engineering, computer science, robotics. That's not a bad thing inherently, but it's a bad thing if you have a very kind of narrow view and you're not bringing in a team of people who kind of understand what's going on, particularly when we're talking about people outside the vehicle and partial automation. Okay, so with the trolley problem, this group out of MIT, let me see it. Who is anybody familiar with the moral machine? Anybody seen it? A couple people? So a team out of MIT put up this, I'm going to show you some screenshots of the moral machine in a second. They put up this exercise, it's still there. You can go, you can take these, look at these examples of the trolley problem and make decisions. You can create your own scenarios, which is kind of interesting. But they got 2 million people to take it in 10 different languages. You can see 40 million decisions about kill or this side or this side. One of the things that I think is interesting, and you're going to hear this as a theme through this, is when they talk about it, they say they're shown unavoidable accidents. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I want you to remember this phrase, unavoidable accidents. Okay, so here's what it looks like if you go to their website, moralmachine.mit.edu. And here's where you have a chance of tackling this question of what I would call classism, right? I'll step back. Right? So you have a decision, people are allowed to say like, oh, do I want to kill the executive or do I want to kill the homeless person? The homeless person doesn't even get a gender. So they're like not even a full person, which is interesting. Here's another one. Athletes versus large people. They don't say fat, but they mean fat. So making some, and you can see in the image here, right? Here's another one. A baby and a large woman, and here's a baby by itself. Here's where they introduce, and I think this is really interesting as a planner or a traffic engineer, this one they say, okay, it's a baby by itself, but this baby was following the law, right? So does that matter in whether we make this decision about, okay, the self-driving car should do one or the other thing?
And they make you pick one or the
You have to pick. Yeah, sorry, if that wasn't clear, you have to pick. Which would you do? So here's one, they start introducing things like a doctor, right? So do we place more value on the life of a doctor or an executive versus, say, a homeless person? And here's a gender difference, right? So we have same amount of people who are going to die in one scenario or the other, but these are men and these are women. And then these ones are following law. These ones I think are really interesting because of the term they use, flouting. They're not just crossing against the signal, they are flouting, which has a value judgment, right? About, oh, those scofflaws. And then here's one where you can tackle kind of age or how we show more care potentially for the elderly. So here's a lot more people will be killed if you choose this scenario, but if you choose this one, it's an older adult, right? And these ones are affecting law. So there's like, I mean, I don't know how many scenarios they end up on there because people can create them still all the time. But, here's one more. Sorry, in case you were wondering, you can also decide whether you're going to kill pets or people. And I don't know how the cats and dogs are flouting the law here because I don't know how they do it otherwise, but they did find that, and I'm not going to go into their paper a lot, but you can find it. It's really interesting. They found biases that, and they differ by different cultures and different countries, but biases, that we would expect that we see in other parts of psychology, right? Biases toward people of higher status or people who, maybe are fit or whatever, and then also towards this idea of law breaking or not. And this was published in Nature, so, pretty prestigious way to go. But my question is, the problem with using the trolleys at all when talking about the autonomous vehicle, right? So in this scenario, the autonomous vehicle has sudden brake failure. So my question is, aren't AVs supposed to prevent that entirely, right? They're supposed to be alerting us way up the chain that, oh, it's time to get the brakes checked, or there's a problem with the brakes, or communicating, the environment is communicating with them, like, oh, there's something that you're going to brake to. And again, this unavoidable accident, that's like the great promise of autonomous vehicles, right? It's a connected system. They're talking to our cell phones and they're talking to our traffic lights, and they're so we're talking a fully autonomous thing, and I think that's where this analogy of AV and the trolley problem falls apart. And a moral decision that isn't addressed in using the trolley problem with AV is like, should they be even traveling fast enough around pedestrians that they could kill them if there's a situation where somebody has to get hit, do they have to die, right? And that's a question that I think we should be asking, because that is a decision that we make upstream of the situation, of them encountering each other. Another problem with this, and I kind of murder this metaphor, I apologize, but it's what I call putting the trolley before the horse, is a lot of these, not fully autonomous, but these assistive technologies are flooding the market. I mean, if you drive a vehicle that's like 2017, 2018, 2019, you have probably a lot of these technologies in your car of the assistance technologies, the lane departure warning, the blind spot monitoring, but then even things like the Cadillac Super Cruise, which is available, which can monitor your gaze. There's a camera on the steering column that's monitoring your gaze and can tell when you're looking away from the road for too long. But unfortunately, even though these things are available, they're not working perfectly. So this is great. Sunlight causes it to disengage. Well, as long as you don't drive in sunlight, you're going to be fine, right? And so we have this thing you see, oh, the sun was in my eyes. I didn't see the pedestrian, right? I didn't see the bicyclist. The sun was in my eyes. Well, now, at least in the current term, like AV is not even saving us from that problem. It's having the same problem. Another problem with having these technologies before we've really had enough chance to prove them is, does anybody in here drive a Tesla? Anybody? No? I've seen them around in Davis. Some people, I know there's around. Whoops. This is what you have to do. This pops up on your screen, and of course you're not going to read all this, and you wouldn't read it all if you were sitting in your car, and that's the problem. It's basically saying it's not that safe, you need to be paying attention all the time, don't check out. Do you want to enable navigate on autopilot while it's in beta? That's the last sentence. And you click on it and you go on your way. Well, that may be fine if you're like agreeing to do a beta testing of an app on your phone that helps you find a good restaurant. But we're talking about, potentially, and there's been crashes and there's been fatalities with these systems, right? So this is why Tesla's, not one, but I think 3 Teslas have run into parked fire trucks. And it's a problem where basically the car that they're following has moved out of the way and they don't know how to deal with a stationary object, and so they run into it. And the kind of answer from, or how he was explaining it, this guy from Caltech, is that they have to make judgments about how sensitive to make these systems, because if they make them too sensitive, you don't go anywhere. And so we have to build in, and I don't know that he meant it this way, but he used this word care. What do we care about? And so you can see how we're building in value judgments into our algorithms, into our engineering. And again, our values and how we express them, I think, is obviously part of car culture and how we do it now, but it's being replicated or continued into autonomous technologies or assistance. So this one, right, Tesla, this promise of all these cool assistive or autonomous technologies, cool battery upgrades, what are we doing? And this is what we're doing, increasing our top speed, which of course is one of the things that we know is the most likely to lead to serious injury and fatality in times of crashes. So is this where we should be putting our values as we continue on to this future? This one I'm picking on Business Insider a little bit. They're talking about the new Toyota RAV4, which full disclosure is what I drive. And in this list of all these great technologies, pre-collision warning with pedestrian detection, etc. And then the picture they went with, and again, is this like how sporty and aggressive the grill is, right? And maybe the last view you get before this car runs you over, frankly. So I just invite you as you're seeing this stuff out in the world to think about what is it they're saying, and yet what is also the message that we're saying about these technologies. And then pedestrians, right? What about the pedestrians and bicyclists for that matter? So I didn't know an urban planning concern group was a thing, I knew it was a thing, I just didn't know that they called themselves that. Designing Hong Kong, he said, so they were doing this bus, they were testing this autonomous bus, and he called it a beeping monster, which made, I thought, a great headline. But he was basically saying, if it drives through a pedestrian area, they have to stand still all the time. Well, what role do they have to play in a pedestrianized area? How do we build an environment where we can utilize AV shuttles, which have a lot of potential uses, but work with pedestrians? Do we want, basically the way a lot of these folks are phrasing this is as though pedestrians are something that are a barrier. They're in the way. This is an even worse case. Dr. Selman is a computer science professor at, I forget which university, but he's in New York. And he's saying, oh yeah, we can totally just be testing these in New York. It's great, things are improving. Can you think of a more complex driving environment than New York? Probably not, especially when you talk about mixing in pedestrians. And then this one issue, there's nothing to prevent a pedestrian, the bullying of self-driving cars, right? So you see these kind of reducing of the pedestrian in the hierarchy continuing on into the AV world. So this headline is actually sarcastic or satirical. In his article, he goes on to criticize this, but it came out of a lot of real headlines and articles and statements being made, including by law enforcement, about, well, pedestrians just need to behave better. That's the problem. Like, this will all these problems will go away if pedestrians, which ignores human behavior and it ignores the built environment, which is typically, what you see pedestrians responding to, right? You do what it takes to survive, not necessarily what someone engineered who thought you should do in a system built for the car. But people are doing it anyways, right? Retraining the pedestrian. So here's one out of Teague Labs. Like, I just love this because of the way she's having to dodge vehicles and everything. Here's one from Jaguar Land Rover, and they had a test course where, of course, there's nothing else because this is the simplest version, where they thought, well, we're always telling people, make eye contact with the driver, right? Just make eye contact and they'll stop with you. So they thought, well, maybe we'll just put eyeballs on our AV. One nice thing I will say that I do like about this is the red, which actually is like a front brake light, right? So it's saying, oh, I am stopping for you. You don't have that kind of like, are they stopping? Are they not stopping? Here's another one that this group is there. This is just a conceptual idea. Again, kind of a front brake or a front system. But these are all kind of still putting the onus on the pedestrian, right, to change their behavior or affect their behavior around these AV vehicles. And of course, the question is technology objective, right? Is it value neutral? And the answer is no. We know that lots of other areas. So anybody see this article in the news recently? This is the most, I'm sorry, with all due respect, the most computer science-y way of titling this. They literally were looking at whether the cars were choosing differently, or the AI was choosing differently between white and black faces, which you would really struggle to get, but it's actually a pretty sexy headline. So what they did is they had the AI looking at, like you would use, the artificial intelligence looking at, if it was in a car, does it, and it was pedestrians, not just people, but actually pedestrians, does it notice black and white pedestrians the same? And they found that it did not, and it wasn't a time of day issue, so it wasn't just like, oh, they have darker skin, and it wasn't occlusion, so they weren't just like, oh, those people just happen to be behind a tree more often. What they did is they looked at the training set that was used to train the AI for how do you know that that's what you're looking at a pedestrian. And they had 3.5 times as many white faces or white pedestrians in the training set as they did black pedestrians, right? So that's another example of the ways that we can bake in our own biases into these things that we tend to think of as objective or value neutral. So that is all trouble for all the folks, some of whom, maybe you, working on full autonomy. A lot of tough challenges to be wrestled with. But what I'm really interested in is what we're doing on the way there with these technologies that, like I said, have already deployed. They're in near-term development, and they're really, a lot of them are being driven like from the industry side, and so they're kind of getting out ahead of us. And a lot of cities and localities don't have mechanisms in place to even control how these are deployed, right, in our environment, who's testing them and where. So here's what I call the near-term problem of AV in the trolley problem. Is what we're really going to deal with in the near future is level 2 and level 3 issues, where in the example of the trolley problem, you have this, this vehicle. It's not going to have to, we're not making a decision of whether the AI decides to hit this person or this person. The AI is going to turn it back over to us. They're either, in level 2, they're not even going to necessarily see the alert, we're going to have to, or the hazard, we're going to have to be watching for it. And in level 3, they're going to say, I don't know how to deal with this, so you're back on deck, right? And of course, these all assume that we're traveling at speeds low enough or slow enough to actually stop in time. So this is a funny example of how some in the industry are thinking about this or talking about this issue. This is a long quote, but I just had to include the whole thing, but the bold is what's important. So these are the head of the AV at Volvo at the time. They were basically realizing that, oh my God, trying to engineer it in these level 2 and level 3 are, almost insurmountable problem because we're horrible backups. It's just too difficult, right? So that's why you do see a lot of the discussion, the Ubers and the Lyfts and the Waymos really focusing on really getting to the further automation. It's because they know how flawed we are as drivers. One very simple problem is that we don't even use the tech we have. So they found out in a recent study that half of the vehicles that came in for service had their lane departure warning turned off, right? I just got my dad, who may be watching, to fess up today that his is turned off. And so even the chances or the technologies that we have that could be assisting us, it's a question of whether we're using them. If we're using them, do we trust them, right? But also, automation does some not great things for us. And we've known this for a long time because of pilots, for decades. What they found that as flying got more automated, and the more pilots could check out, kind of, that when they had to re-engage, their motor skills were okay, could re-engage. You have that muscle memory, so they could, using the stick or whatever was not so bad, but their decision making had really deteriorated, and it doesn't take very long for that to happen. So you think about that with what's happening with, and pilots are highly trained, right? And they have to constantly be redoing their training on that thing. That is not true of driving. I have not taken a driving test since I got my driver's license at 16, which is a while ago now, and a lot has changed. And this point here, and I'm not going to talk a lot about the Boeing crash, but it is relevant, right? Because what they're finding happen is, software was deployed or not included in one case that the pilots didn't even necessarily know about, and they didn't have a lot of training on how to respond to it, or when they did respond, things didn't work. So basically, it's this question. This article was talking about, one, how familiar are we? What kind of training do drivers even get? When I bought my new car, which has a whole suite of safety technologies, it was like a 2-minute at the dealer, like, here these are, like, have fun, I hope you read the manual, which I did not, and I study this stuff for a living, right? But then also the idea of what happens when we disengage or need to re-engage from a task. So this is how long we've known about this problem, right? This is an actual quote from The Tempest, from the 1600s, about how when we get tired, or traveling tires us out, and we get fatigued, and we check out, and we can't make decisions, right? I had to share that. So, and it's not just a matter of re-engaging and being like, okay, what am I doing in the environment? We also know that drivers don't treat all people equally. And some of this, I don't know if everyone loves this headline, right? This came out of a study out of Berkeley where they had someone cross the road and they looked at the status of the cars that stopped, and they basically found the fancier your car, the less likely you are to stop for someone, which fits with what social psychologists know about how people value their time and social status. This is an older study about whether wearing a helmet or being perceived as a woman or a man affects how close they come to you and things like that. And just the point is, and neither of these studies talked to drivers, measured what was going on with them, so we don't know if it's conscious or subconscious biases. The point is that we have biases, we're acting on them in the roadway environment and making some kind of discretionary choice about how we treat people. So this study refers to a study that I and some colleagues did where we actually it was a field experiment where we had white and black pedestrians trying to cross the street and seeing whether people stopped for them or not. And we found racial bias and people not stopping, especially if other people didn't stop. It was replicated in Las Vegas with women, same kind of thing. People, especially once they were in the crosswalk, people weren't stopping for the black women, right? And even after you controlled basically it was happening actually even worse in the high-income neighborhood. They did it in a high-income neighborhood than it was in a low-income neighborhood, which had worse infrastructure. So it wasn't just an infrastructure issue. And then this one has gotten a lot of headlines in the last week and a half, 2 weeks. Did everyone hear about this one? Where some Australia researchers, Alexa Del Bosque and others, they were basically teasing out whether people view cyclists as animalistic. So I think they had a similar one with a gorilla, or kind of alien, insect-like. And it turns out that not only do half of people think cyclists aren't actually very human-like, but also it predicted whether people were aggressive towards bicyclists, right? So again, all this kind of evidence tying together the fact that we as drivers, we're flawed humans, whether we know it or not, and we're acting on it whether we know it or not. So this is from my research where I showed people these 3 silhouettes of bicyclists and asked them first, this is a classic, it's called a feeling thermometer, how warm you feel, or how do you feel about bicyclists. And you can see that people and this is the percentage, right? So people were generally colder towards bicyclists rather than warm, but also that it differed. So people were felt the strongest. They did not like the roadie, the spandex-clad warrior, didn't like the fixie, the kind of upright, helmetless, this one, and people perceive this one as older, slower. Interestingly, I also asked them kind of like a select all that apply about their stereotypes about these people. I didn't say anything else. I just showed them the silhouette. This one's more fit, but doesn't follow the rules, not predictable, right? So you see these differences. And again, that we have these ideas about people outside the vehicle. And partly it's because they're very visible in their, whether it's their just being a person, right, versus like in your carcoon, as people call it, or you can see their race or their gender often, or sometimes class markers, and just the fact that cycling in general has a lot of baggage. I mean, there's been some great research out of here about that, right? So one of the things I'm the most interested in understanding, because we haven't really looked at it yet, is how do these even intersect with how drivers, their actual behavior? And then certainly, how does that affect their re-engagement in the driving activity when you have these partially autonomous or conditionally autonomous technologies? So I think part of the stereotyping and the negative attitude stuff about pedestrian and bicyclists is the way we talk about them, and I've highlighted some of these kind of quotes and everything. And this was from a study some colleagues and I did where we looked at 200 articles, 100 pedestrian articles, 100 bicyclist articles, and looked at when there was a serious injury, or maybe just any crash, but serious injury or fatality involving a bicyclist or a pedestrian. And we looked at things like, do they say the vehicle hit a person or the driver? Do they mention, and most of them mention a vehicle and not a driver. Or there's no agent at all. So basically a pedestrian was hit as though it just happened, right? Many of them mention the driver stayed on scene or the driver was cooperating. I have trouble thinking of any other potential crime or certainly incident like that where we make a point to call out that someone followed both basic decency and the law, right, is to not flee. So there's a lot of kind of framing issues. And this one of I mentioned before this idea of crashes being preventable and predictable. Well, a lot of them treat it as an isolated incident rather than looking at systemic issues, rather than looking at the built environment. Like, oh, this person, like the Uber crash, right? Oh, she was crossing outside of a crosswalk. Well, she was in a clear line of travel, crossing to a bus stop, in a huge stretch of road that had no official crossing, right? So a lot of these crashes don't report on that. And they really kind of obscure the potential solutions, things that we should be looking at, like driver speed and driver distraction, and certainly built environment. And what concerns me is that I'm seeing these kind of things replicated in our discussions of autonomous technologies, right? So we know jaywalking, you've probably heard it in your classes. Jaywalking, very old, really kind of from the onset of the auto industry, from cars, as a way to criminalize walkers, people walking to get them out of the way. So we're seeing that this is Zooks, right? So they're considered one of the top players in this world of AI and autonomous vehicles, and they got a lot of heat for this on Twitter, using this term jaywalking, again, as though a pedestrian is something that, one, is doing something wrong and at fault, and is really something that's in the way. And then this one, there was a lot of people rushing, of course, to make judgments about the Uber crash. I keep saying the Uber crash, I don't know if everybody's familiar, but Uber was testing an autonomous vehicle in Arizona, and it was a Volvo vehicle, but they had turned off a lot of the Volvo auto or autonomous assistance technologies, even I sometimes mix up the terms, so that they could test their own. And they had what's called a chaperone, or a driver that's supposed to be monitoring the environment. And I didn't want to play the video. You may have seen it. The dash cam video's, kind of horrifying. But you could see clearly that the person who was supposed to be paying attention was looking down. And then in further investigation, they found that the driver, she said, oh, I was looking down at the console. I just didn't see her. And it turned out in the investigation that she was streaming a TV episode on Hulu until the moment of the crash. And so there was, this issue of how people check out. And it's a real problem with testing these and deploying these onto the streets of, it's really tedious. And again, like looking back at the pilots thing, when you're sitting there and not much is happening for a long time, we check out even more. And so, but this testing is happening in a lot of cities at this point. But after that happened, there was a lot of quick headlines where you saw this. They stepped suddenly in front of the self-driving car. First of all, it wasn't totally self-driving. And second of all, the step suddenly, as it turns out, if you're familiar with the crash, she was crossing from the far side. So there was, I forget how many seconds that she was visible and should have been seen by both the driver and the car, and was actually hit as she'd come across. So it wasn't like someone just leapt into place. But you see that phrasing a lot, right? Darted out, stepped suddenly. And so I think we have to watch out for that, again, being perpetuated about what behavior it is that we're criminalizing. So my current study is looking at, like I said, I'm really interested in how this affects our partial automation, but we don't actually know that much about how it affects our driving even without these technologies. And so I'm doing this right now with a couple colleagues from Texas A&M, and it's a combination of a driving simulator where we have eye tracking and some biometric data, so galvanic skin response, which is basically your sweat, heart rate, respiration, and then also a implicit association test, which I developed during my dissertation work, which looks at, it's a timed sorting test, which gets at people's kind of subconscious preferences for one thing over the other. So that's looking at drivers versus bicyclists. And then I'm happy to talk more at the end about the specifics of that. And then they take a survey getting at some of their attitudes, their self-reported behaviors towards bicyclists, their own, like, how much do they drive, how much do they bicycle, things like that. And so really, this is like one of the first, if not the first, of putting all these things together at one time so we can understand. So let me just, I don't want to block the view here. So here's our simulator setup. So this is a simulator at Texas Transportation Institute at A&M. And we actually had to have this programmed because there was not, I don't know if any of you do simulator research, but I kind of expected, it'll just be plug and play, we can just go. And we actually had to program in these interactions with bicyclists. So we programmed in 4 interactions, an overtaking maneuver, so on a straightaway with a bike lane, and then a right turn and a left turn situation where the bicyclist is going straight, and there's a potential for the driver to make a right hook crash or a left hook crash. And then one situation where they actually meet at a 4-way stop, and the bicyclist gets there slightly first, and we just wanted to see like what was their kind of decision making about letting the bicyclist go or not. And so they come in, they do a practice drive with nobody else on the road, and then they do drives where they have these interactions at 2 different speeds to kind of test the role of speed in these interactions. And then, we're taking all this information. So this is super interim because we're actually only about 2/3 of the way through the data collection. So don't quote me on any of this, but we're already seeing some really interesting trends that fit with the research I did and some other research that's been out there. But so this is one that I don't think has been explored nearly enough. 80% of drivers said they're nervous driving near a bicyclist, right? And it kind of, I had to step back a few years ago and think about, like, how do you even learn as a driver? How are we conveying to drivers, like, what it is you're supposed to do? And there is, I think, this nerves can come from this idea, like, a lot of people anyways, are conscious of your ability to cause serious harm. But I do think that can sometimes translate then into the anger that we see towards bicyclists. It's like a very human kind of coping mechanism of, like, I'm afraid, and then you lash out and you're angry. 56% said they're not comfortable. I mean, that's a huge percentage of people who don't actually even know. So when you think about things like the 3-foot passing law or these other ways we're trying to address overtaking behaviors, it's like drivers don't even really know what they're supposed to do. And I think, too, there's a mismatch potentially in the perception of some drivers who I've talked to, they say, I try and do it fast and get it over with, like, because I think the bicyclist probably doesn't want me, like, lurking there. But as a bicyclist, I'd rather have someone pass slow and close then go flying by me where I don't have really a sense of how close they are. It's just they're so fast. It's more nerve-wracking for me. 80% said bicyclists shouldn't hold up traffic. Just like there's a very blanket statement. This number actually surprised me. 1 in 4 admitted that, and this isn't like an anonymous survey, like they're in our lab, so they know we're asking these questions. And a quarter of them said that they'd expressed anger, which I appreciate their honesty because that's probably true. And then this one is my favorite stat so far. 93% get mad at bicyclists who break the rules, but only 2%, which was like 3 people so far, said they get angry at drivers who do, right? Not that like drivers aren't breaking the rules, but like they don't get mad about it. And so that's a very classic kind of in-group, out-group problem that I think speaks to the stereotypes I've talked about, or the study out of Australia with cyclists not being seen as human. And then this is an example of kind of some of the other data, and again, like I said, this is very interim, so we're just processing it. But so here's results from this implicit bias test for the people who've done it so far. So basically, we're showing, and this is sadly what I would expect, but it's interesting to see it in the data, that many more people, significantly different amount or more people have this moderate or strong pro-driver bias or anti-bicyclist bias, right? So you have, 50% of people, there was kind of no bias, they were kind of right in the middle. But this is moderate or strong, potential subconscious bias about bicyclists. What we don't know yet is, does that help predict, or is that linked to the driving simulator behavior? So it's a little hard to read, but on this axis is time, and on this axis is the distance from the bicyclist during the overtaking maneuver. So what you have here is people are behind the bicyclists at 300 meters, and then this is where they're closest to the bicyclists. And this is 30 seconds, this is 60 seconds. So this is a huge amount of variability in the time, considering that everybody is driving the same speed in the simulator at this point and when they encounter the bicyclist. So the bicyclist appears triggered off a point. So everybody has the kind of same opportunity to make the same passing or overtaking maneuver. But each line is a different driver, right? So you can see how some people really quickly passed the bicyclists and went on. So this is as they're getting out in front of the bicyclists. But you see some people who kind of lingered behind, and then passed. And again, this is all like just coming out. So we haven't had a chance to look at how does this tie with people's subconscious attitudes or their conscious attitudes, or I think what's most interesting is their own behaviors. So like in my previous research, one of the best predictors of good attitudes, at least, was whether people bicycled themselves. Okay, no kidding. But it didn't matter if you were someone who just like rode on a trail or rode as a workout for exercise. That didn't help improve your attitudes towards bicyclists. You had to do it frequently, so at least once a week, and you had to do it for some kind of utility. So to work, school, to the store, whatever. And that has obviously real implications as planners in particular of who are we targeting and how are we trying to target the behavior. It's not just enough to have something where it's like, well, more people on bikes has lots of good benefits, has great health benefits, but it doesn't necessarily translate to making us better drivers. So stay tuned. I'm very excited to see what happens with this, but this is what we'll be looking at next. So just kind of bringing it all together, my work that I'm doing going forward, and I think is something that I'm glad to see a lot of us talking, or some of us talking about, is this idea of like, what role does tech have to play in our transportation future? And this is an ethical question that's happened at different points of history, right, where we have a real chance to think about like, okay, is it a tool, or is it something that's controlling us? Is it a positive or a negative? This is a great article that Tamika Butler at Tool Design Group wrote a great article that I encourage you to read, but they were basically talking about some of the racial equity stuff as a person of color, and also just this idea that so much of what's dominating the autonomous world right now is like very much what I call technical optimism, right? tech will save us, tech is inherently good, progress is tech is good for us. And, I think there's so many challenges to that, and the Three Revolutions program, I think, here is doing a really great job about saying, like, no, here's how it's going to need to progress in order for us to realize those benefits. And I think one thing I invite people to think about is, how are we even defining success in this world? And this is, again, I feel like I'm picking on Zoox a little bit, but this is the banner, I think, for their Twitter account or their website. I can't remember, I pulled this off. But so this is Lombard Street in San Francisco, right? One of the twistiest, or maybe the twistiest street in the world. And this is them showing, like, our car is so great it can navigate Lombard Street. But there's no people anywhere outside the vehicle in this, right? So questioning whether if your success of your autonomous technology is successful only in the absence of human behavior, then is it really success? And so, certainly I don't know what all your studies are and everything, but I think I'm talking probably mostly to planners and engineering folks. And this is something that Tamika talks about in their article, is we know a lot of the things that we could do right now, that we should be doing right now, that can make people safer, right? And so I'm saying that these autonomous and semi-autonomous and assistive technologies should be done within a safe systems framework rather than the other way around. So you may have heard of Vision Zero or Safe Systems, right? These are, I think Vision Zero is from Sweden and Safe Systems is like more the Netherlands, but this idea, again, of focusing that they're preventable, you have to integrate human failing, right? We have to plan for that, but it is possible to prevent fatal and severe crashes, and that it's a system. And I really liked this tweet from this woman who's working in the AI area. And I'm just going to read it because I think it's important. Much like NASA helps uncover solutions to problems on Earth, I think AV can help us become better, safer road users. It requires us to break down our processes and interactions in order to train the system. The act of doing this makes us understand the entire ecosystem better. And I highlighted this because I think it's really important, this idea of looking at the transportation system, in particular as we introduce all this technology and deploy all this technology as an ecosystem. So I'm just going to leave you with a few quotes that I really like. This Michael Crichton one. I was going to use his one, we were so busy asking whether we could, we didn't ask whether we should. I think that's also applicable. But this is my other favorite, civilization, however imperfectly, to protect us from ourselves. This is the moral machine folks said. We don't have the luxury of giving up on this moral machine. And I'm arguing that that's true, but we also can't just be waiting for tech to save us, right? We have the responsibility both to be more moral drivers right now, which we're certainly capable of, but then also planning and engineering a more moral environment. With that, I will wrap up.
Oh my gosh, so much to think about. Questions?
Happy to take questions or challenges, yeah.
How much do you think the potential for AVs personally owned to shift some of the problems or the
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, should I, yeah. The question was, where is this on the spectrum, if I'm understanding you, like if it's fleet owned, right? So this idea of a fully shared, potentially future where, it's all kind of like a ride hailing, for instance. I just, call a car when I need it to go where I need to go, but I don't own it. It doesn't stay at my house, et cetera, versus the full ownership model. And I think there was the recent talk and article on the liability issues, which I thought was really interesting, because mostly my first instinct to say, like, a more fleet owned is going to help us do a lot more to realize the benefits that we think, as far as freeing up space for other infrastructure, right? Reducing single occupancy vehicle travel, all that stuff. And that's true in a shared. But they were raising some interesting points where, if you're talking about like commercially owned, who does liability fall on in those situations? And I'm not talking about fully autonomous. I guess I'm talking about kind of partial autonomy. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think this is annoying to say, but I think it depends. It's complicated. But I think it's worth stepping back and thinking about, because from the planning side, you think, oh my gosh, shared definitely just like, yes, let's push everything towards a shared economy or a shared system. But I think when you start, dealing with, okay, if it's shared but it's owned by private corporations versus like governmental agencies, you have very different things about who's responsible, how does the funding work, who does the system actually serve, that I think raises really interesting questions for economists and political scientists that I am not equipped to answer. But good question.
You talk a lot about how I don't know if I go as far as to say victims of the built environment, but how that there's a lot of issues with the built environment that affects the way that humans behave, and that drivers make a lot of assumptions about how pedestrians and bicyclists ought to behave.
Yeah.
It's sort of a challenge / question is, to what extent is there a responsibility on those VRUs to use the built environment in the way that it was intended to be used for the safety of everyone involved? Even if we could magically all agree on what's the perfect ideal built environment and we had political will to do it, it's not like we can just tear up every single street in New York City and put it all down again. So in the meantime, what do you think the share of responsibility ought to be between the vulnerable road users using it as intended and people who are in less vulnerable situations, accounting for the fact that these other people are also?
Sure, that's a great question. So he's basically asking, at what point is there a personal responsibility aspect, that how people should behave? Do we have some onus of, crossing at crosswalks or et cetera? And I think there's a couple kind of telling ways that you ask the question, and one phrase you use a couple times is as it's intended, right? Using the system as it's intended. Well, then we need to step back and say, intended for who? And if you look at the history of our environment and a lot of the forces that shaped, well, the for who is people in cars. But that isn't necessarily like what we value. What we value is getting places to people of opportunity, places where they have opportunity to have a good job and have a social life and be healthy. Those are our values, but what we have is a system based on a very certain tool which kind of predetermines our ability to do a lot of those things only by that one mode, right? So your point about, we can't just rip up all the streets. You're right, like we have a lot of concrete, but there's a lot of things that we actually can do to reallocate space that we can do very cheaply and easily today, and we're doing all the time. I mean, you look at what was done, New York's kind of an extreme example, right? Like not many places are like New York in the sense of like that dense and that busy, but like everybody thought that like New York is gonna collapse if we take cars out of Times Square. Good God, like, the end of the world. And if you look at what they did first as a pilot, and that was so successful that they've now implemented, worked, taking cars out and creating places for people to gather, you see that and that's done through paint and through, again, this reallocation of space. It wasn't like they completely ripped out the streets of New York and put something else differently. So I also think that, I get the point that people say, oh, we just all need to behave better. But it's kind of like, again, what is it that we really value? And if what we value is a kid being able to grow up in such a way that they can experience the environment and explore their street and be safe, then no, I don't think there's an onus on them to not dart into the street. I think it's more on me as the driver of the car with the ability to cause the harm to slow down and drive much more slowly. Or at night, this is something that my colleague Rebecca Sanders talks about all the time. Like, our speed limits don't change at night. We don't really have a general shared thing that we should slow down significantly at night. But that's crazy. We don't perceive the same at night, right? So again, I think if there's anywhere that personal responsibility is needed, it's more on the side of those who have the ability to cause harm, and that's us as drivers. So, yeah, thanks. Yeah. Right, so if you remember back on that scale I showed, they actually showed people that kind of, it's like the evolution of man, but it was from an insect to a person, and I think like the other one was more like a gorilla to a person. And they were basically asking people like, where do you think cyclists, because it's not a cyclist at the end, it's a person, and they're like, where would you put cyclists on this scale of like and like, do you remember, I don't know if you remember yeah. So that, and they asked him, I think, some other questions about how you feel about bicyclists, but those were the main ways they did it, is showing those and asking them, like, where would you put cyclists?
I have some questions about the validity of that question.
Okay. Yeah, that's, yeah.
I would, if they would put anything else on the right side.
Yeah.
A space shuttle, whatever, there will always be a distribution.
Right.
You will always get some distribution there.
Right.
Got it?
the most direct question.
There will always be a distribution.
Yeah.
I mean, are you implying that they're not human by asking the question?
Right. And I mean, you'll have to take that up with Alexa, because I don't know. That was not my study, but that's how they did it.
A lot of really, really good stuff, and I'm trying to kind of put it back together, because I think that if and correct me if I'm wrong, what I feel
Sure.
is that you tell us, don't think that automated autonomous cars will solve the problem that we need to solve with changing the modes shift and so on. I'm not sure that there was an argument as such. The arguments are much more subtle and are much more, okay, we can save half of the pedestrian fatalities, still half will be killed with automation. Is that something bad? So where is this line between, yes, we have some solutions that are far from being perfect, but it's not that we do that instead of doing something else.
Sure. Okay. So Bill's asking, like, what are you asking? So I guess, what is my argument, and am I arguing, like, what is good enough? I guess, right?
Yeah.
So that's a good question. And I'm definitely not arguing, I'm not anti-tech, I'm not anti-automation at all. My point in the first half was to kind of problematize, to use an academic term, the way that we're just, a lot of people, not everyone, and probably not a lot of people in this room, but if you look at the public conversation, you look at the industry kind of approach, that is very much like tech is good, we're going to be able to, eradicate human bias and human error. And that's not true, because we're already seeing that there's ways to propagate human bias and error into our algorithms, for example. My second half is more just saying, like, one, I think, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe we're going to have a fully automated fleet everywhere, awesome, 10 years, but I don't think any of us really think that. So I'm really interested, okay, what, as we do deploy these other technologies, these partial technologies, there's still so much we don't know about driver behavior related particularly to people outside the vehicle. And because we don't even know that in our current driving situation, we really don't know what's going to happen when people are checking out even more, or people are even more trusting that the tech is going to do something for them. So that's my argument. My argument isn't that, I'm trying to understand how you were phrasing my argument. And unless you're asking about, like, if I seem to be arguing about on-road testing and deploying some of these, I am arguing against that, I guess. I do think there is too much of cities not having enough of a role or any kind of leverage against, say, these for-profit companies with very proprietary data that we don't have access to. We being like the city, don't have access to even understanding what are they testing, what are they finding, like what are they introducing into it, and what kind of, I still don't think anything, I don't remember, maybe someone knows more about the Uber crash than I do. Like, if any liability has happened, like that the chaperone driver wasn't charged, even though they were streaming the voice. Like, Uber, I don't know, has been, I think there's just a lot of questions that we're getting out ahead of ourselves. And it isn't, and my point was, like, it isn't like getting out ahead of ourselves with a phone app. It's like we're getting ahead of ourselves in the road environment. Do I think that these technologies have the ability to reduce injuries and deaths? Absolutely. But I think we need to have a little bit more structure into how we're testing that on the road. That was my argument. So I had a question, I felt like back there. No? Hold on, I'll come back to you. Sorry.
So let's go back to the built environment. So
Yeah.
do you think there are some studies and some people
So Dylan's asking whether dropping speed limits would have an effect. I try not to say impact when I'm talking about crashes, unless I mean crashes. Obviously, I'm very into semantics and the meaning of words. So I think speed limits and speeding more generally, or speed limits as an indication of speeding, is a huge thing to focus on. And certainly the changes that we're starting to see in how we set speed limits, right? So if you're familiar with the 85th percentile and basically setting speed limits based on like what most of us people seem to feel safe. The problem, as you probably learned in like Transportation Planning 101, is that the environment gives us a lot of our cues about what feels safe. And I live in Texas, where the roads are enormous. And so even if you dropped speed limits, it would then just become an enforcement issue. And we know that enforcement isn't necessarily equitable or doesn't fall on the same folks the same way, whether it's getting pulled over or the people getting pulled over when they're biking and walking. So that's a whole separate conversation we can have about the equity of policing. But really, dropping speed limits, depending on where you are, right? It depends. Like if you're dropping the speed limit in streetcar neighborhoods, I think you could immediately have an effect just by dropping the speed limit, potentially, because there's already a lot of the cues in the environment. But in Texas Ave, which runs through the heart of College Station, Texas, the road environment says, welcome, speed on through. And so I think you really have to have those built environment changes, which again, we could do now. Like we have both through more temporary materials and more permanent additions to the streetscape and reallocating the streetscape. Like I said something recently, we're redoing, like have ripped out and are redoing a huge arterial that cuts right along campus. And the fact that we're not doing protected bikeways along that breaks my heart. And I truly believe you could do it, and the numbers show that it wouldn't affect the throughput. It's right next to a college campus, so you don't have a lot of like minor streets on one. I mean, it's like the perfect case, right? And we're not doing it. And so people are just going to go back to going 45 miles an hour right along a university campus where a ton of people are walking and biking.
So what do you see as the outcome of your research? Do you see like implications for car companies or like cities adopting this kind of stuff or like investment in infrastructure? What do you see adopting on a long-term horizon and short-term horizon?
So he's asking what I see the outcomes of my research. That's a great question. I feel like my old advisor probably planted you. I find it very easy to get caught up in the research itself, answering the questions itself. But you're right. It's the so what do we do with it that's really important. And I think, initially when I was looking at this work, I thought I was really going to be looking at, okay, what does this mean for driver alert systems in the car? What do we do? How do we use, say, haptic feedback? How do we balance too many alerts with not enough alerts? And I got into it, and I think people are working on that, and I think it's really important. But it's a really tough nut to crack, too, as an academic, to like get things into industry. So, and as a planner at heart, and as someone situated in a planning department, I'm really focusing on more of the kind of built environment. So, first answering some of these questions to better understand how does driver re-engagement differ based on if there's a car stopped in front of them versus a person on the sidewalk, right? And intuitively, it makes sense that those would not be the same, but just even understanding it better. But then we can start testing, what are the signals that the built environment would have to do to both, kind of change behavior, like slowing driving, but then also potentially reduce the effect of when they have to re-engage and there's a vulnerable road user, so if that makes sense. So better informing kind of our design, and then thinking about what are the policies that cities potentially, and because I'm really focused on, kind of the public side of things, so looking at cities, counties, regional governments, things like that. How are they taking into account these technologies in their planning? So that's a great question, though. Other questions? Mr. Avenat?
How do you think those
So Mr. Avenat has asked how localities should take these into account. So that's a great question, and I think so. One thing would be, and actually you know more about this than I do, is in the issue of parking. So how are localities potentially using parking pricing and parking regulation to incentivize sharing versus private ownership of vehicles would be kind of just like a very broad one to think about. Certainly about where these technologies are allowed. So you might be, like you're working with a transit agency who wants to do this great autonomous shuttle, which, in the right environment, in the right route would be great, but we are going to prioritize these pedestrian areas of town, and we're going to prohibit these kind of things happening in our cities. I'm less familiar, and I think it's tougher to think about, and again, I think they were talking about this in the liability talk, of what leverage do cities or counties have in some of these like early deployments of technologies, and that is, I don't know. I feel like that is a really open question right now of what ability do you have at the local level versus say the state or federal level to say, no, you must go through this process. And I know California has a process but I'm not as familiar with it. Like you can go to the website and see who's testing, like who's been approved, but I don't really know that much about the process. Maybe somebody here can answer that. But I think there's a lot more that could be done of exploring how do we understand, and also the data sharing, and that's another one that I think is really tough, a tough nut to crack. And this is, I don't think when ITS came on, and intelligent transportation systems, you were starting to see some of these data issues and private ownership of data and things, but it just was not on the scale that we're seeing it with these technologies. And so I think this is a really new world of like, how do we interface with the corporate and with industry in a way that I'm not sure we have, certainly not in the time that I've been working in the field. So.
Let me rephrase the question.
Okay.
So, you're saying that the autonomous vehicles, there's three components. You have your other users, vulnerable road users, and then you have the built environment.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're making the argument that the built environment needs to change to be able to better accommodate both the natural behaviors of the vulnerable road users and also accommodate the autonomous vehicle. How should the built environment, let's use the roadway as an example, how should the design of that roadway change in order to safely accomplish the movement of these two users?
Gotcha. Okay, so he's asking, how should the built environment change to accommodate vulnerable road users and autonomous vehicles? So my answer would be, in the near term, we should be doing things that we already know work to make drivers slow down and behave safer, and that they're going to basically, how do I say this? We should be focusing on that, and if you're working on the side of interfacing with industry and making safer tech and safer cars, then that's great. But if you're working on the planning engineering side, we should be focusing on reallocating space and basically, I call it implementing our values, right? Is our value the efficiency, throughput, and reduced delay of cars, or our values of our community, access, healthy, safe communities? We already know how to do that, right? We know how to implement a built environment with, turning radii and fewer lanes and shelters, and I'm thinking like bus shelters and street furniture and all these things that we already know how to do. And I think continuing to focus on that and not getting distracted by the shiny objects of autonomous technology is what, like if I was currently, or what, as I talk to communities right now, is focusing on that. So, great question. Yeah.
Do you see a need for an agency like that came about with, we're all actors in the aviation industry.
Yeah.
We need to hold ourselves accountable.
Yeah, so he's asking if we need an FAA for autonomous vehicles, and I think that is a great question. And I think that would be a great PhD for public administrators, political sciences, or engineer who wants to really dive into, because I haven't seen it. If it exists, I haven't seen it, but I'm not going to pretend to know if it does exist, of really understanding the history and the roots of the FAA and how that applies or doesn't apply in this case. And I think there's a lot of argument to be made that it does. And I think it's a particularly interesting time to be looking at that question because of what's happened with Boeing and the, kind of the flaws that have been revealed in that process as it currently exists, where, it was an optional software upgrade, some of the safety technology potentially. And of course, this is all evolving, so some of the stuff may be proven that it's, this instead of that. But this question of like, who owns the data? How does it get deployed? At what level does it have to be tested? What is the training for the users of the, the vehicles? That's what's happening with pilots, right? So I think that's a great question. Yeah.
I'll take the prerogative of the last comment. I think it's more of a comment than a question. So much to think about. But there's a concept I came across not so long ago that's really I've been thinking about that in terms of we get a technology and then society decides how to use it and
right.
how it's going to fit into society. But I think you've really very nicely pointed out how there's so much subjectivity that is built into the development of the technology itself. That is not an objective thing,
Right.
as you say. And given that, then we should be more explicit about that, right? I mean, technology doesn't just happen.
Right.
I mean, we could intervene more as society to have the technology develop.
Right, and that's
what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think that, so this question of, talking about it as a technology as a social construct, a social good, there's a whole field of study, STS, so socio-technical systems, which looks at these kind of questions, which I don't know how well transportation folks specifically have interfaced with that world. So I think there is a lot of literature we can look to that I think is relevant. I also think that part of the challenge, and they probably talk about this in STS, is that we've had these issues throughout history of trying to decide how are we going to incorporate this? How does this become part of the social fabric? But the way that stuff can happen so much more rapidly now, and whether it's information or actual technology, stuff is just rolling out at a faster pace. So it's so much even harder to have these conversations about where does this fit in our value system in society, and how does that vary across cultures, which I think is really interesting. So yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's hard because as a planner, engineer, there's so much already that we're focused on, and then now you have to be a historian and a sociologist and a psychologist, and there's so many pieces of it, which of course speaks to good teams and collaborative research.
Interdisciplinary.
Very interdisciplinary programs, and really taking advantage of that to enrich your research team or your project teams, or even just your thinking about these issues, I think is really important. So I have to say, as someone who's been in the field for 15-ish years now, it is just a wild time to see the changes that are happening. And I think as someone who's mostly focused on the safety of people outside of vehicles, on vulnerable road users, it's I feel this real urgency for folks who are in this area, like me, to be hang on, so much is happening so fast. We need to make sure that we're not just replicating these same problems and biases and challenges that we've had, kind of since the car was developed.
On that note.
On that sad, depressing note, sorry.
Let's thank Sarah